Hollywood has a fear all its own, not failure, but disappearance. In a place where the lights rarely go out, people grow accustomed to believing that to still appear is to still exist. To still be named is to still have value, and leaving within that logic is often seen as losing. Robert Redford never believed in that logic. When he began to slow his pace, Hollywood was still ready to keep him. His fame remained intact. The glow had not yet faded. Safe roles, familiar invitations, repeated rounds of applause. All of it was still there. But Redford understood something else, something few dare to name. Staying too long can also become a form of dependence. He did not leave Hollywood because he was forgotten. He stepped back while he was still being called by name. Throughout his career, Robert Redford has always been a paradox, a face Hollywood adored, yet a man who never truly bent to its gaze. He stood at the center of the frame, but kept an invisible distance from the very glow that surrounded him. Redford did not chase the spotlight, nor did he allow the spotlight to decide who he was. Some people spend their entire lives trying to extend their presence. Robert Redford spent his time learning how not to be held in place. What defines his story is not the number of films or awards, but a quieter choice. Understanding that leaving, if done at the right moment, is also a form of art. Leaving was not an act of escape, but a way of preserving the right to define oneself. And that is a rare thing in this world. This story does not begin at the moment Robert Redford stepped away from the lights. It begins much earlier, in the early years of his life, when he learned how to stand alone, quietly, and without waiting for anyone else to lead the way. Robert Redford was born in 1936 in Santa Monica, California, a coastal land filled with sunshine, a place often imagined as the setting for a carefree, open childhood. But for Redford, his early years carried little of that sense of ease. From a very young age, life taught him a quiet lesson. Not everyone is sheltered long enough to grow up without worry. Redford's childhood was unstable, not because of poverty or dramatic upheaval, but because of a prolonged absence, an absence shaped by loss and silence. When he was just 8 years old, his mother died. That death did not produce loud scenes of grief or tragic memories retold again and again. It was simply a disappearance. And for a child, that disappearance became the foundation of how he would later view the world. After his mother's death, Redford grew up with a strict, reserved father. His father was not a man who displayed emotion. He believed in discipline, in self-reliance, and in the idea that each person must stand firmly on their own feet. In that household, there were few explanations. No long conversations meant to soothe the grief of a child who had just lost his mother. Some things were left unsaid, and gradually they were no longer expected to be said. It was within that atmosphere that Robert Redford's independent inner life began to take shape. No one deliberately taught him how to be strong, but no one stepped in to shield him from loneliness either. Redford learned to observe more than he spoke. He learned to manage his own emotions because there was no one else to do it for him. Years later, reflecting on his childhood, he admitted that it was precisely this absence that led him to understand a basic truth early on. No one can live life for you, and no one can protect your dreams in your place. Redford once said in an interview that he grew up rather early, not because he was wiser than others, but because his circumstances did not allow him to depend on anyone. It was not rebellion, nor was it an act of defiance. It was simply a way of surviving. When there is no one to lean on, you are forced to learn how to stand upright. At school, Redford was not a standout student. He did not seek attention, nor did he try to become the center of things. Instead, he kept his distance, somewhat detached, somewhat instinctively independent. Later on, he admitted that he never truly felt fully integrated, not because he was excluded, but because he never felt the need to belong at any cost. There is a line often attributed to Redford that captures this spirit well. "I was never a rebel. I just didn't like rules." He did not fight the world, but he also refused to let the world decide who he was supposed to become. That spirit did not grow out of fame or success. It originated in a childhood where silence became a familiar language. Losing his mother early introduced Redford to the fragile nature of life. There were no guarantees that the people you love would always be there. No assurances of stability. And so, he learned not to stake all of his emotions on things beyond his control. Instead of seeking comfort from the outside, Redford turned inward, building a private inner world where he could regulate his own rhythm of living. That reserve was later often mistaken for coldness. In reality, it was a survival mechanism formed very early on. When a child realizes that there will not always be someone to stroke their head and say, "Everything will be fine," they either fall apart or learn how to stand on their own. Redford chose the latter. Those years did not produce a loud or overtly ambitious Robert Redford. They shaped a man wary of dependence, cautious with attachment, and especially vigilant about allowing others to define his worth. His independence did not come from pride. It came from necessity. And perhaps it was here that an invisible thread was first woven. A thread connecting the boy who grew up in silence in 1936 to the man who would later remain calm enough to step away from the lights of Hollywood while the world was still calling his name. The early years of Robert Redford did not unfold along a straight line. The educational path people expected, college, degrees, a clearly mapped future, was cut short early on. He did attend university, including a period at UCLA, but he did not see it through, not because he lacked ability, but because Redford could not find himself within pre-existing frameworks. He left the lecture halls with a familiar, hazy feeling. He was living, but did not truly belong anywhere. That departure did not lead him to a new plan. It pushed him into a void. And Redford accepted that void as something necessary, even though he did not yet know where it would take him. He wandered to Europe, living days without direction, painting to survive, sleeping in cheap rooms, moving through cities without carrying any promise of a future. This was not the romantic journey of a young man seeking inspiration. It was the quiet escape of someone who had not yet found a place for himself. In Europe, Redford painted a great deal, not to become a painter, but to exist. Painting gave him another way to speak, without words, without explanations. But even art could not ease the growing sense of stagnation. He drank more than necessary. The days passed slowly, heavily, and offered no clear answers. Later, Redford would admit that it was a period when he didn't know who he was and didn't know who he wanted to become. That sense of not belonging followed him back to the United States. Hollywood at that time had not opened its doors. There were no roles waiting, no lights, only a young man carrying academic failure, a few wandering years, and an increasingly closed-off inner world. Redford studied acting, took odd jobs, stood at the edges of opportunities he never quite reached the center of. Everything was provisional. Career, money, even faith in himself. Then came the greatest upheaval of his life. In 1959, Robert Redford's first son died from sudden infant death syndrome at just over 2 months old. There was no warning, no chance to prepare. A small life vanished in silence, leaving behind a void no words could fill. Redford rarely spoke about this pain. He did not turn it into a public story, nor did he use it to explain his life. But in one rare moment of reflection on the loss, he said, in essence, that there are pains that never leave. You simply learn how to live with them. That was not overcoming. That was acceptance. The death of his son did not break Redford in the way people often expect. It made him quieter, more reserved, and deeper. If he had already been familiar with loneliness before, after this tragedy, loneliness became part of his identity. He learned how to endure pain without an audience, without loud consolation, without explanations. From that point on, Redford formed a very different relationship with his own emotions. He did not avoid sorrow, but he did not expose it either. He kept it inside, like an underground current. And it was precisely this current that later created the particular weight in his screen presence. A sense that behind the calm exterior, something unspoken was always there. Redford's early years did not produce a confident artist. They produced a vigilant man, vigilant against superficiality, vigilant toward outside gazes, and especially vigilant toward easy promises of success. When you have lost the most important thing in silence, praise suddenly feels far lighter. It was through failure, wandering, and loss that Robert Redford learned a skill no school could teach: the ability to stand firm without needing immediate recognition. The ability to keep going, even when you do not know where the road will lead. And perhaps it was here that that still unknown face already carried something rare. The calm of someone who understands that fame, if it ever arrives, will never be a place to lean on. The moment Robert Redford stepped into the light did not arrive like an explosion. It felt more like a slow shift. One day, he was still standing at the edges of opportunity. The next, that face was everywhere. Yet even as Hollywood called his name with excitement, Redford kept his familiar reserve. As if he understood that light, no matter how brilliant, was never a place for absolute trust. In 1969, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid was released. The film was not only a major commercial success, but it also inadvertently placed Robert Redford in a new position: a star. The role of the Sundance Kid gave him an image that was both distinctive and accessible, not the rigid cowboy of earlier decades, nor an invulnerable hero. Redford appeared youthful, agile, slightly playful, slightly reckless, a new model of masculinity that did not need to strain itself to prove strength. His chemistry with Paul Newman created a rare cinematic partnership. They did not need to compete for the spotlight. Audiences saw in Redford a natural, unforced appeal, a luminous face, a composed gaze, a kind of presence that invited attention, even when the character said very little. The film's success turned him into an icon almost overnight, even though Redford himself may never have truly sought that outcome. Hollywood quickly realized it had struck gold. In the years that followed, Redford appeared continuously in major projects, but it was not until The Way We Were in 1973 that his image was fully etched into the public memory. That romantic drama was not merely a love story, but a dialogue between ideals and reality, between emotion and principle. In the role of Hubble Gardner, Redford portrayed a man who was charming, gentle, and romantic, yet never weak. He did not need to raise his voice to convey depth. Everything resided in the way he remained silent in the face of conflicts that could not be resolved. The pairing of Redford and Barbra Streisand became iconic. Yet unlike many heartthrobs of his era, Redford did not trade depth for admiration. He was handsome, but never showy. Romantic, but not fragile. A form of masculinity that did not require excessive explanation. Critic Pauline Kael once remarked that Redford had a look that Hollywood loves, but carries within him a reserve that Hollywood cannot fully control. That very reserve soon became a problem. Hollywood loved Robert Redford's face more than his thinking. It loved the star in front of the camera, not the man asking questions behind it. Safe roles, familiar scripts, stories packaged to please the masses, all gravitated toward him. And in the eyes of the industry, Redford seemed destined to remain in that position for a very long time. But Redford sensed the trap taking shape. After years marked by failure and loss, he did not enter success with naivety. Fame did not convince him that he had arrived. It only clarified one thing. If he continued to follow Hollywood's inertia, he would be defined entirely by his appearance, something he could never control forever. In a later interview, Redford once said, in essence, that he always felt uncomfortable being looked at more than being listened to. This was not the complaint of a star. It was the vigilance of someone who understood both the value and the limits of the spotlight. As Hollywood sought to mold him into a flawless archetype, Redford began to perceive the emptiness behind the applause. Success arrived quickly, but it also easily turned people into products. And for Redford, what was frightening was not failure, but the loss of choice. He once shared that what troubled him most was not whether he would get a role, but whether he still had the ability to say no, or whether that ability had already slipped away. Redford's acting career in this period was a chain of victories, but his inner life did not move in step with those triumphs. Each successful role added another layer of expectation onto his shoulders, and each layer pulled him further away from a lesson he had learned early on, not allowing others to live his life for him. Redford did not resist Hollywood. He understood the rules of the game, but he also understood that without caution, the most beloved roles could become the most sophisticated prison. A prison built from praise, admiration, and the fear of being forgotten. For that reason, even at the height of his acclaim, Robert Redford had already begun to think about other paths. Not to escape the light, but to avoid being consumed by it. He began seeking control over the stories, the perspective, and his own life. Hollywood placed a crown upon his head as a star. But Redford soon realized, wearing the crown for too long can make one forget who they truly are. Robert Redford's fame reached a state many people only dream of. He was not merely famous, he was almost universally loved. That face became synonymous with success, reliability, with an image so safe that Hollywood could place its bets without fear of risk. Yet it was precisely at this seemingly perfect point that a trap began to form. Redford was boxed into the role of the golden boy. It was not an insult. On the contrary, it was a sweet title. The gentleman, the handsome man, trustworthy, non-controversial, someone who did not disrupt the norm. But the more praise he received, the more confined Redford felt. The roles offered to him grew increasingly similar. The stories were written to fit neatly into the image audiences had grown accustomed to. And Hollywood, with all its good intentions, began to love that perfection more than the real person behind it. Redford grew weary of safe roles, not because they were bad, but because they no longer challenged him. He once said in an interview that what worried him most was not failure, but repeating myself. When an actor begins to anticipate every audience reaction, every emotional beat of a character, acting ceases to be discovery. It becomes habit. And Redford was not born to live by habit. At this stage, he began to look at cinema from a different angle, not only as the man in front of the camera, but as the one who decides how stories are told, who gets heard, who is left behind. This was not an impulsive decision. It was the result of many years of feeling seen, but not heard. In 1980, Robert Redford released his directorial debut, Ordinary People. No cowboys, no romance, no familiar glow attached to his name. Instead, there was a quiet, painful family story, centered on loss, guilt, and the silences that cannot be bridged between people. It was not an easy film to watch, and even less easy to sell. But that was exactly what Redford needed. Ordinary People was not an attempt to prove that he could direct. It was a quiet declaration that he wanted freedom. Freedom from the perfect image. Freedom from the expectation of always being pleasant. And most importantly, freedom to tell stories that did not need to please everyone. The film's success exceeded all expectations. Ordinary People won the Academy Award for Best Picture, and Robert Redford received the Oscar for Best Director. That victory was not merely symbolic. It confirmed something Redford had long sensed. Behind the camera was where he truly became himself. Notably, Redford did not celebrate this triumph as a dramatic reinvention. He did not declare a break from acting. He did not tell a story of career rebirth. He simply continued along the newly opened path, with the same restraint and clarity that had always defined him. In a rare remark, Redford once said that directing made him feel as if I could breathe more deeply. Not because of power, but because of responsibility. Responsibility to the story, to the actors, and to the things that cannot be expressed through a handsome face. Redford's greatest crisis was not a professional one. It was a crisis of identity. When you are loved for a simplified version of yourself, holding on to the more complex parts becomes far more difficult. And Redford understood that if he did not act, he would be consumed by the very image Hollywood had created for him. Behind the camera, he no longer had to please anyone with his appearance. He was listened to. He could ask questions. He could be accepted with silences and imperfections intact. And most importantly, he was no longer defined by age, by looks, or by degrees of on-screen appeal. Ordinary People marked a turning point that was quiet, yet decisive. From that moment on, Redford was no longer just a star granted power by Hollywood. He became someone who actively reclaimed control over his own life, not by stepping away from the lights immediately, but by standing in a different position, one where the light no longer shone directly on him, but on the stories he wanted to tell. And it was in that moment that Robert Redford realized an essential truth. Perfection, if sustained for too long, becomes the most beautiful cage one could ever willingly step into. After finding freedom behind the camera, Robert Redford did not enter a more dazzling phase of life. he entered a quieter one. Not because he lacked ambition, but because he began to choose very carefully what was worth keeping in his life. Fame was no longer the center. Family, private relationships, and the feeling of living in alignment with his personal values became what mattered most. Redford's private life was never exposed in a noisy way. His marriages, fractures, and family losses were always kept at the edge of the spotlight. Not as an act of concealment, but because he believed that certain parts of life can exist only in silence. After many personal upheavals, Redford gradually withdrew from the intensity of social life, spending more time in private spaces, places where he could live slowly, without needing to explain who he was. Redford once said in an interview that he never felt comfortable when private life became part of the performance. That was not coldness, but a conscious choice. He had seen too many people trade peace for attention, and he understood the cost of that exchange. For Redford, love and family were not arenas for proving anything, but places to return to. From that need to return, one of the most important decisions of his life gradually took shape. In 1981, Robert Redford founded the Sundance Institute in Utah, a place far from Hollywood, far from powerful boardrooms, and far from the commercial logic that dominates the film industry. Sundance did not begin as a prestige project. It started as a small space where young filmmakers could experiment, fail, and learn to tell their own stories without being forced to please the masses. Redford did not stand at the center of Sundance as a symbol. He stood at the margins, listening. Sundance did not bear his name. There were no monuments, no ceremonies honoring him personally. What Redford wanted to build was not a legacy shaped in his own image, but an ecosystem where voices outside the mainstream could exist. He spoke very clearly about this philosophy. If you want to help somebody, don't stand in front of them, stand behind them. That line was not a slogan. It reflected exactly how Redford chose to live at this stage of his life. Sundance quickly became a foundation for American independent cinema. From there, countless directors, screenwriters, and actors found their first opportunities, not because they resembled Hollywood, but because they differed from it. Redford believed that difference did not need to be polished into something easily consumable. It needed to be protected in order to preserve its original power. Notably, Redford did not run Sundance as a controller. He did not impose a personal aesthetic. He did not create a Redford school. Instead, he created conditions for others to discover their own voices. It was a rare form of leadership in an industry accustomed to outsized egos. At this stage, Redford began to step away from the center of his own story. He appeared less. He spoke less. Yet his influence spread further than ever, not through image, but through opportunity. Not through roles, but through pathways opened for others to continue forward. There was a quiet sense of redemption in that choice. Not redemption for specific mistakes, but for the very mechanism of Hollywood, a system that had once loved him for his appearance, but had never truly listened to him. Rather than resent it, Redford chose to create a parallel world where being heard did not depend on fame. Love, for Redford at this stage, was no longer explosive emotion. It was patience. It was making space for others to shine. It was accepting a position outside the frame without feeling that anything was lost. He found wholeness not in applause, but in meaning. Redford did not build monuments to himself. He did not seek to be remembered as a legend. Instead, he built pathways. Pathways for those who came after. Pathways for stories that had once been overlooked. And it was in this act of stepping back that Robert Redford found a rare form of salvation. The freedom to live by something he had believed in from very early on. That true value does not need to stand at the center in order to exist. There is a quiet paradox in Robert Redford's story. His influence became most visible when he began to step away from the center. Not when his name dominated posters. Not when the box office called his name. But when he moved back into the shadows, allowing others to step into the light. Over time, Sundance accomplished something Hollywood has rarely dared to attempt. It handed over agency. Not financial power, but the right to tell one's story in one's own way. In an industry accustomed to measuring value by revenue and media reach, Sundance asked the opposite question. What happens if we allow smaller, stranger, even uncomfortable voices to exist? Robert Redford did not create Sundance to oppose Hollywood. He created it because he understood that Hollywood cannot and should not be the only place that defines cinema. Over decades, Sundance became the cradle of American independent film, a place where films did not need permission from mainstream taste in order to speak. Hundreds of directors, screenwriters, and producers found their first opportunities there, not because they resembled Redford, but because they were allowed to be different. Redford once said, "What Sundance is about is making space." Sundance was not a movement, but a deliberately preserved gap, a space for experimentation, for failure, for imperfect stories. And it was precisely the creation of that space that changed the course of American cinema in the most enduring way. The list of names emerging from Redford's shade continues to grow, but the significance lies not in the numbers. It lies in the spirit. A generation of filmmakers grew up believing that they did not need to become copies of anyone in order to be heard. That cinema does not belong only to those who speak the loudest, but also to those who speak the truest. Meanwhile, Robert Redford gradually disappeared from the screen. There were no grand announcements, no ceremonial farewell. He appeared less and less, until he was nearly gone. For many stars, such a retreat might be seen as a loss of status. For Redford, it was the natural completion of a journey long in the making. He did not abandon cinema. He simply refused to remain at its center. The loss here was not the loss of fame, but the acceptance of letting go of a familiar image, letting go of being seen, letting go of being directly admired. That is not easy, especially for someone once loved precisely for his presence. But Redford understood that if he stayed too long as an icon, he would inadvertently take up space from stories that needed to be told more urgently. There is a striking consistency in the way Redford stepped back, from a childhood spent learning how to stand alone, from early years marked by silent loss, from a period of fame tempered by vigilance toward the spotlight. Everything seems to lead to this moment, the moment he chose to disappear at the right time. Robert Redford's legacy does not lie in the number of films he made or the awards he received. It lies in a fundamental right he helped restore. The right to tell one's story in one's own way, without having to ask for attention. In a world where everyone is pressured to appear constantly, Redford reminds us that retreat can also be an act of responsibility. A critic once observed that Redford used his influence to make himself less visible. That is not a paradox. It is a choice. When he stepped back, other stories became clearer. When he fell silent, new voices were heard. And when he disappeared from the screen, American independent cinema did not lose an icon. It gained room to breathe. In his later years, Robert Redford no longer needs to prove anything. He has passed through the light, understood it, and known when to step away from it. Perhaps that is why he matters more than ever after stepping back, not as a star, but as a quiet gatekeeper, opening paths for those who come after. And that is a rare kind of legacy, the legacy of knowing when to step aside so that someone else's story can begin. Robert Redford never truly left Hollywood. He simply refused to let it define who he was. In a world where the lights demand constant presence, where disappearance is treated as a form of failure, Redford chose a different path, quiet, unhurried, yet consistent to the very end. He spent enough time in Hollywood to understand its allure, long enough to see the traps wrapped in glamour, and with enough clarity to realize that not every act of staying is a victory. For Redford, value was never measured by how long one remained visible, but by how fully one could remain oneself. Looking back on that entire journey, a quiet through line becomes visible across his life. From a boy who grew up in silence, learning to stand on his own after losing his mother too early. From a young man carrying failure, wandering, loss, and wordless pain. From a star celebrated by Hollywood, who nevertheless kept a cautious distance from the spotlight. And finally, from an icon brave enough to step back, making room for other stories to be heard. Robert Redford never rejected Hollywood. He simply refused to hand over the right to define himself entirely to it. In one interview, he once said that what mattered most to him was not how he would be remembered, but whether I am still living according to what I believe. That was not a manifesto, it was a way of life. In the later stage of his career, when many still struggled to cling to the light, Redford chose to retreat into the shadows. Not out of exhaustion, not out of fear, but because he understood that there are moments when one's presence begins to take up space, meant for something more important. And when that happens, leaving is no longer a loss. It becomes a responsibility. The wisdom in Redford's choice lies in the fact that he never turned his departure into a performance. No announcements, no spectacle. He allowed his absence to unfold naturally, as part of the current, just as he had lived, without display, without coercion, without the need for verbal affirmation. Today, when people look back at Robert Redford, they remember more than a handsome face or a collection of iconic roles. They remember a rare kind of presence, someone who understood that the greatest form of power is not the ability to stay forever, but the ability to leave without losing dignity. In an era that constantly urges more, Redford reminds us of the value of enough. His story does not offer an easy lesson. It does not claim that everyone should step away from the light. It simply opens a quieter question. If one day the light no longer helps us live in alignment with ourselves, do we have the courage to step away from it? Robert Redford understood something that many stars never learn. Staying is easy. Leaving with dignity, that is what is rare. And if this story made you slow down for a moment, if it left a small silence within you amid the everyday noise, leave a small sign below. Just one sign. So that we can continue telling stories like this. stories that do not speak loudly, but are deep enough to remain. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more cinematic journeys into the lives behind the fame. This is Hollywood Biographies, the light, the silence, the legacy.